Over time, we're taking in too many carbs, too much sugar. Insulin's ramping up to deal with blood glucose. A lot of times that'll be masked because the insulin's rising and keeping the blood glucose in check. So people are only measuring the blood glucose. They may be missing what we're talking about here. Let's talk about from an insulin and glucose perspective. The glucose would be later after metabolism breaks. That would be down the line when somebody's in that type 2 diabetic range. But let's start with insulin, then get to blood glucose and talk about problems that arise in the body. Again, starting with insulin, things like cancer, damage to blood vessels. We've been focusing on obesity, but there's all kinds of other problems under the hood.
Sure. So when and to back up for a second, when we were talking about the things like excess sugar and carbohydrates, that's certainly one of the key drivers, but there's many ways that people can obviously gain weight, but yes, that's one of the most common reasons is the excess consumption of these types of refined sugary carbohydrates in the diet. But as someone gets further along in that stage and they start to consume more of these foods, when sugar rises and you consume it, actually, let's back up for a second and take your audience through this. So let's say that someone were to consume rice or bread or a potato. What happens? Okay, well, let's say you consume that food. You went and got like Chinese food, who knows? And there's a bunch of rice, right? And maybe or sushi or something like that, and you consume it. It goes to the stomach. Your stomach starts to break it down, and it takes let's say rice, and starts to break it down from these chains of glucose called polysaccharides, because saccharides are sugar molecules, to the individual glucose molecules, and then it's absorbed. And once it's absorbed, so the more you consume, the more sugar that's going to be absorbed, right? And the more sugar that's absorbed, the more that those sugar molecules cause an elevation in blood glucose. Well, that elevation in blood glucose causes this very unique but yet powerful tissue called the pancreas to sense the elevation in glucose and work like a thermostat. As glucose rises, the higher it rises, the more it's going to generate and release insulin rapidly into the bloodstream. Okay, rapidly, because an abundance and elevation in glucose signals the body, okay, we're in a state of abundance. We need to now store this tissue, at least first in the liver, also block fat breakdown because we want to keep that fat because we're in an abundant state. And now if we have excess spillover, we may put some more in the muscle. And as a result, it's signaling all these growth and signals in the body. Once that happens, blood glucose comes back down. Then you go through the state of not consuming over time. However, your question is, what happens when insulin, I assume you're getting at, is in abundance over time in excess amounts? Well, we know that insulin has a pretty powerful effect on various tissues. Excess amounts of insulin within the body, in and of itself, can cause insulin resistance. Let's say at the peripheral tissues. One of the most common peripheral tissues is the muscle. The muscle is the largest sink of glucose in the body, what we call the large glucose pool. Okay, you have the small glucose pool and the large glucose pool. We can explain that more if your audience is interested. But the large glucose pool is the muscle. This is where you can store, at least in an average body weight female, somewhere around 300 to 350 grams of glucose and stored glycogen. And in males, 500. If you're very well trained, maybe north of that, right? So 500 grams of glucose. Okay, we're talking about 2,000 calories worth of glucose just sitting in your muscle. That when insulin is in excess at that tissue, in those tissues, this is what happens in type 2 diabetes actually, is when it's in excess over time, you start to develop resistance towards that insulin. So at the cellular level, there's internal signals that allow for when insulin binds to that muscle to cause a cascade of internal signals that allows for glucose to be brought into the cell. Well, when excess amounts of insulin is exposed to that muscular tissue, it actually develops resistance. So internal signals within the muscle start to change. You start to develop dysfunctions to the signals within the cellular tissue. And as a result, insulin doesn't work as well. Okay, that's one of the ways in which it occurs, but there's other ways in which insulin resistance may manifest. But another area of the brain that is key beyond the muscle is the brain. We know that insulin has a direct effect in key areas of the brain, okay? And so when we think about something like when someone goes during a lunch, okay, this may not be you, but someone may be listening who this may be the case for, where let's say they had lunch, they woke up and they took their kids to school, they go to work, They've been at work for 4 or 5 hours. They say, okay, it's lunchtime. Thank God. Oh, let me leave and go get some food, enjoy my life for like an hour if they're lucky. And then they go and eat like a sandwich. Okay, so they eat a sandwich. That sandwich probably has 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrates in it. They consume the sandwich. They feel great for 30 minutes. Then about an hour to an hour and a half, 2 hours later, they start to feel pretty fatigued. All of a sudden, they're starting to feel that post-lunch lull. They feel like they need to take a nap. Well, in part, that is the rise in blood glucose levels, but a huge component of that is the insulin effect on the brain. Okay, and insulin's effect on the brain can cause some of these effects, and alongside glucose changes, like fatigue, right? So we know that insulin could also affect that, but we also know that insulin's associated with water uptake and water retention in various tissues. This is why excess amounts of insulin is associated with high blood pressure, and the reduction of insulin within the body or reduction of insulin resistance within the body is often associated with a resolution in many cases of hypertension or high blood pressure. And really the list goes on and on and on. And this is why so many people talk about insulin resistance as one of the root causes of many of the chronic diseases that we are seeing in excess amounts today. It's certainly not the only cause, okay? I'm not going to sit here and say that it is, but it's often apparent in many of the major conditions we see and rising levels within the developed world. Obesity is clearly one of them. Okay, but there's other conditions that we know are also linked to this. We talked about high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. Okay, there's clearly a link there as well. We know that excess insulin is the hallmark physiologic change in type 2 diabetes called insulin resistance. I could go on and on and on and on and on, but we know that insulin resistance is at least common and prevalent in many of the major chronic diseases rising today. And if it's not the direct cause, in the case of, let's say, type 2 diabetes, it certainly is argued to be one of the causal drivers. And I say argued to be, I mean, there's many causes, right? Many different causes for each person. But in other conditions, maybe it's a passive bystander, not a passive bystander, but an active bystander adding gasoline on the fire of other conditions, let's say mental health conditions, where these changes in things like glucose and insulin are challenging the brain's ability to stay in a normal metabolic state, a neurobiological state. And this could place some individuals who are at higher risk for maybe rapid fluctuations or dysregulation within the brain, which is interesting because we see this emergence of the ability as individuals start to normalize glucose levels, reduce and normalize insulin levels, so we're not having the high and variable insulin or glucose levels, that individuals start to see improvements in some mental health conditions. Again, those data are very preliminary, I must acknowledge, but it's very interesting nonetheless to see that linkage, knowing that there's a clear neurological impact of something like insulin in the body. So insulin's a very, very powerful hormone. It's a master regulator. It affects various tissues. We mostly think of it as a fat storage hormone, but it has a lot of other effects within the body. But really, we're not concerned about it. It's essential to life, but in excess is where the problems arise.
You gave a couple examples there, somebody having rice, somebody having a sandwich. How different is that response in the body with insulin and blood glucose, somebody metabolically healthy versus somebody metabolically deranged?
So one of the first major changes we see is this change in beta cell response. So when individuals start to develop things like prediabetes, or they start moving further and further along in insulin resistance and develop prediabetes, we see actually changes in the ability to actually have the first and second phase insulin response. So right as blood sugars rapidly start to elevate, you have this rapid initial response of insulin. Well, in individuals who start to develop prediabetes, and we've seen this in individuals with obesity who have prediabetes, they lose a lot of that initial first insulin response. As a result, their second insulin response is delayed, which means they have an initial higher peak in blood glucose than someone who is healthy. But then because it's delayed, they have a delayed reduction in blood glucose after the food has already been absorbed and resolved from the bloodstream. And now you can get into incidents of postprandial, or what they say post-food intake, hypoglycemia. So that's really one of the initial changes that occurs. Is actually occurring at the beta cell, or where the insulin is actually produced at the first phase insulin response. But as you start progressing further and further, it can get so far down the road in the case of type 2 diabetes where the beta cells themselves begin to be damaged and not able to produce as much insulin at all. So not only are you not able to have insulin do its job when it is produced, but now you're not able to produce as much. And this is really what happens at the kind of extreme tail end, or further end of type 2 diabetes, where individuals are very far along in the disease process, and insulin's not just the inability to function, but it's the inability to even produce enough of it. And now that's a very, very, very dangerous situation down the road of that disease.
Is that reversible when somebody gets to that point?
So I'm going to answer that by describing it from before someone gets type 2 diabetes. So we've conducted randomized controlled trials in individuals who, where some of them develop prediabetes. And what we see is that individuals who are more healthy than not, who have prediabetes, if they're able to make rapid changes in their diet, particularly the reduction in carbohydrates in their diet, low enough to reduce glucose and insulin levels, they see a rapid, within days, resolution of their prediabetes. It disappears, okay? Now we see individuals who aren't as healthy who develop prediabetes. It can take more time. And oftentimes the individuals who have prediabetes who may have excess adipose tissue, they may require not just a reduction in things like carbohydrates, but a reduction in body weight, sustained elevation in physical activity, because that keeps insulin more sensitive, to really resolve that issue. As you start pushing further and further along from prediabetes to type 2 diabetes, the earlier on in the process, the easier it is to reverse. Why? Because you don't have a lot of the damage to various tissues and dysfunction that arise with chronic elevations in glucose, insulin, but all the other things we spoke about. The excess amino acids, the excess lipids, the excess inflammation, oxidative stress, and particularly those molecules, the inflammatory molecules and oxidative stress molecules, are what are actually going to go to tissues and actually cause damage. Okay. There are other causal effects of things like glucose and excess levels that directly damage tissues, by the way, like the vascular tissue, the brain tissue, etc. But when insulin is in excess, when someone's pushing further and further along, they're starting to accumulate this damage, which is why when we look at individuals who have developed type 2 diabetes and have lived with it for multiple years, it's often believed that it's just a manageable disease. They're just managing this disease. Even examples where they put individuals on very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets and got them to lose weight in the case of these big studies by Virta, which is a company that puts individuals on very low carbohydrate based diets. They have been able to reverse a large number of patients, but a lot of them are not. And if all those patients had prediabetes, you would expect them all, if they had lost weight and changed their diet, to resolve their prediabetes. But in the case of type 2 diabetes, we're not seeing that. And that is largely attributed to the damage that occurs over time. And because in type 2 diabetes, in order to oftentimes to reverse type 2 diabetes or put it into remission, whatever you want to call it, everyone's got their word they want to use. It also requires weight loss, sustained weight loss. In fact, one of the key drivers that someone reverses their type 2 diabetes is weight loss. And so you have to lose weight too. And that is incredibly difficult for people to do in the first place, but to sustain it. In fact, there's been statistics that have been around for quite some time that if someone tries to lose 20% of their body weight, which by the way, a lot of people with type 2 diabetes need to do, that less than 5% of people will lose it and maintain it for at least a year. Well, if you have type 2 diabetes and you have 20% of body weight to lose, not only do you need to lose it, but you need to maintain that weight loss for the rest of your life. So if less than 5% of people are doing that, at least up to a statistic about 5-10 years ago, then it's going to be incredibly challenging. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is that it also develops not just a shift in diet, but also a sustained commitment to a lifestyle that's going to allow you to sustain weight loss, which obviously has been a major challenge across the world.
You mentioned these people that went to Virta and weren't able to reverse their metabolic dysfunction. Are they able at this point to determine that up front? Is there certain signs and symptoms that'll alert them to who these people are?
I don't actually know the exact answer to that, to be totally honest with you. I would suspect that there's a number of factors that go beyond just why, if someone, there's a sustainability factor as well here, right? So when someone is recommended to go on a very low carbohydrate diet and do the exercise, are all the people doing it the same way? Are all the people adhering to the protocol the same way? Are all the people exercising as much as they should? And everyone requires a different degree of lifestyle change to induce these type of effects. So if that's the case, is everyone doing what they have to do to the magnitude they need to do it to cause those effects and sustain them? I bet the answer, a lot of that is just due to the inability for everyone to achieve the same outcomes by just adhering to the protocol to the same degree. Because this isn't necessarily an easy thing. We know that ketogenic diets, amongst all dietary changes, is maybe one of the few diets that by default has a ton of evidence that shows that people volitionally reduce their caloric intake. That's probably one of the few reasons that it's incredibly powerful and effective for that situation of weight loss. Because if it didn't resolve hunger, it is going to be incredibly difficult for it ever to be successful for sustaining weight loss for individuals. But in that case, I don't know the exact answer to that. I suspect a lot of it just has to do with the person's ability to actually sustain the lifestyle, because I would put a lot of my money, okay, and probably your money too. I take your money too. I take my money and your money, we'll put it into a pot and say, if those individuals fast safely for an extended period of time, I would bet that many of them will resolve their diabetes if they fasted long enough. But that's an extreme intervention that's not sustainable over time. You can't go without food forever, right? But it goes to show, if you push them to the extreme, then they probably would all resolve their type 2 diabetes, at least for the time that they're in that state. So I suspect a lot of it is just, are you able to put someone in a sustainable place that allows them to push their glucose and insulin biomarkers into an ideal range for long enough to get them to resolve their disease state? And if not, maybe they had to push further, and pushing further is not a sustainable thing for some of those individuals.
Do we know somebody who has pushed really far and they get to that point you talked about where the beta cells are being affected, destroyed, and insulin's actually decreasing because it can't produce it in pancreas? Is that ever reversible?
To my understanding, once tissues begin to die, similar to in Alzheimer's, very far progressive stage of Alzheimer's, when you actually start to see neurological or brain tissues dying, it's commonly believed that that is not reversible. Which means that you would be, in the case of type 2 diabetes, where the beta cells are being destroyed. There is data that shows, okay, there are stem cells that you can restore various tissues within the body. That all that is known to be true, but I don't think it has much application here. When someone has true death to various tissues, you often don't see a massive restoration of those tissues, although there's a percentage of individuals that are more likely to restore some of that than others, but that's a small percentage. And so it's largely believed to not be the case. So if someone were to be able to, let's say, reverse their type 2 diabetes when they're at that stage, it's almost certainly because the remaining amount of tissues present are able to assist them sufficiently with the dietary change to resolve glucose and insulin levels, or resolve glucose levels with the limited amount of insulin they're able to produce into a normal range. And actually, a great example of this is something called pancreatitis. So when there's actually damage to the actual pancreas, like true damage to the pancreas, where people lose complete functions of portions of their pancreas, you often don't see a massive resolution after the disease is present, right? Like after the disease is present, but after the event occurs, they've lost permanent damage to the parts of the body that produce insulin, at least portions of it. And so in large part, when those people develop that, which is actually called type 3C diabetes, is one of the, where you actually develop a form of diabetes in response to pancreatitis. You know, a lot of people say that, like diabetes or Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes in the brain. Well, there actually is a real type of type 3 diabetes, which is, and there's actually like 9 different types, and they're actually usually in result to damage the pancreas, like a pancreatitis. And it's largely believed that that's largely not reversible, but there are examples, although rare, of people doing very impressive revolutions to their health, their lifestyle, and seeing the ability to reverse some of these events, but it's usually the exception, not the rule.
I want to come back to insulin resistance. When we were deep into that, you mentioned that when it comes to chronic disease, it was a big player, but there were other players. I'm curious, what would you consider other big players in that realm?
Yeah. So, it's hard to really say what the universal problem is, right? A lot of people get very upset when people say, well, it's metabolic dysfunction. Because they're like, what does that even mean? Well, okay, but then you can get down to the mitochondria. Is there mitochondria or energetic disruption? Michael Picard is someone who's written an entire book about this concept and has talked extensively about it. He's a professor at Columbia. He does a lot of research on mitochondria. There are disruptions in energy. That is a pretty universal concept. We know that there's elevation in insulin and insulin resistance with some of these major conditions. We also know that chronic elevations of blood glucose levels can also be problematic. But I guess the question for a lot of people would be asking, okay, these are things that are early signs of things going in the wrong direction, Jesse, but what do I do about that? And what I do about that can also give you clues. So we know that dramatically reducing the things that cause glucose exposure into the blood at very high and variable levels, or things that will cause insulin levels to be spiked or released at higher levels, are solutions to many of these problems. Now, for whatever reason, that's controversial. When someone says, if you lower your carbohydrates in the diet, because that's the most common and potent way to elevate glucose and insulin in the blood, that becomes controversial. I think the only controversy to that, Jesse, is that people would contend through maybe some false argument that one is superior to another tool that may also work. Look, if there's another tool that works, awesome. There's multiple options in the toolbox. But there's nothing controversial about looking at the ability to reduce carbohydrates in the diet. Carbohydrates increase blood sugar levels. They increase insulin levels. And yes, if you reduce them, if you have one of these conditions we spoke about, you can reduce glucose and insulin. And if those are the driver of your condition, you can reduce those as well.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
I was a fat kid growing up. I had obesity as a kid. I failed for over half a decade on all these various diet strategies, and I eventually found success with reliably and sustainably changing my diet.